What's happening, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy Jack Slack, Fights Gone By podcast episode 131, coming at you after UFC 236. Gonna skip the news today because there really wasn't that much. I mean, Nick Newell's got a fight. One did announce a wicked kickboxing tournament with Giorgio Petrosian and Yodson Klyin, and Rich Franklin's going into the UFC Hall of Fame, and that's about it. And they had some big press conference, one of those useless press conferences like the Go Big press conference where nothing's actually announced or happens, but they get to make a big deal of it. Anyway, let's talk about the fights because they were fucking epic, or at least the ones we wanted to be were. So we'll start at the co-main because I think that was my favourite of the two. But Israel Adesanya versus Kelvin Gastelum for the interim middleweight title. Interim titles more and more common nowadays. Obviously, 2 interim title fights on this card. Largely bollocks, but does mean that we get to see Israel Adesanya and Kelvin Gastelum go 5 rounds instead of 3, which, if you saw the last round especially, you probably appreciate. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. We talked about Israel Adesanya and how his striking style seems particularly well suited for MMA. Compare him to someone like Gokhan Saki, who came over, and both accomplished in kickboxing, Saki probably more so. Actually, definitely more so. But both accomplished in pure kickboxing. But Saki's style really hasn't been certainly didn't adapt as well to MMA. And while Saki didn't have the quality clinch work and takedown defense that Israel's surprisingly developed, a lot of that was to do with Saki's style being about earmuffs and wicked fast combinations. Whereas Israel Adesanya is more about baiting people in, stepping back counter. His style, or certainly the style he's adopted in MMA, really exploits the things that he faces in MMA that weren't so much there in kickboxing. Guys weren't lunging wildly after him. He had to pick at them a bit more and work in a more traditional kickboxing style in kickboxing. But in MMA, dudes were willing to chase him, so he's always leaving his head out there and then pulling back, going off on an angle and catching them as they overextend. And we especially talked about his framing and stuff. That was something I fell in love with him for Glory. I can't remember which one, but he fought that Canadian dude, Ryan something or other, Thompson. In that fight, in fact, on that card, because I think he fought twice that night, he was throwing from both stances. He'd throw a 1-2 or he'd throw his rear straight, and then he'd leave it out, frame off the opponent, like bisect their body with his arm and stay down behind his shoulder and hop off to the side. And from there, he could continue like throwing a combination or wait for them to follow and counter. And I put up an article about that saying, look at this lad, he's awesome. And Israel Adesanya immediately replied and was like, yeah, no, we were working on that. We saw so-and-so do it and we were doing this and that and the other in camp. And I was like, oh, this lad's smart. Yeah, he's got a good team around him and they really have given him some interesting tools. But that framing off people really works well in MMA. And we're going to talk about this as a theme generally today. But one of the things that I like about that framing is that you're not, when you're like punch and immediately pull your hand back as fast as possible to your guard, that's a very boxing centric or a boxing related development. You get your hand back to your guard because your gloves are your guard. Whereas with tiny gloves, it's better to be able to get down behind your shoulders and elbows and things, big pieces of bone and muscle that will be in the way. And when you're framing off a dude, you probably, like, if you do it well, like Israel Adesanya does, you're probably safer than if you were trying to get back to your hands by your chin. That lead shoulder, we're going to talk about it with Izzy today. We're going to talk about it with Dustin Poirier. Peter Yan is another interesting one where he fights from that very high shoulder stance. His chin is always tucked down behind his shoulder, which is a very 1940s, 50s style boxing stance. But in MMA, you can't rely on the gloves, so I really like that. Anyway, the point I was trying to get at before I went off on a ramble was that Izzy uses a lot of framing on people like that, and Gastelum really surprised him in the early going. And I think a lot of what got Gastelum in on these things was his speed. But if you watch the very first one where he cracks Izzy as Izzy's framing and moving off, it's almost like he's either like parrying or trying to arm drag that arm. It's, where dudes get carried away chasing after Israel Adesanya with their hands in their guard, punching with one hand and the other hand up or whatever, or loading to punch. Gastelum was actually trying to slap his hand out of the way as he came after him, and he was doing that throughout the fight, and it meant that he was getting in quicker than, certainly easier than Adesanya seemed to expect. But the other thing was Adesanya, a lot of his game is establishing the distance and finding the range. People talk about this all the time, but if you watch Muhammad Ali fight or anything like that, they had this understanding of range, but they did have to get that range. You know, it was a case of working out how long that opponent's jab was. Especially if you watch like Ali versus Liston, because if you watch Liston fight anyone, they come out expecting his jab to be one length, and it's like half a foot longer because he's got these ridiculous arms. Like if you watch his last fight against, can't remember his name, guy who Rocky was based on, the Bayonne Bleeder. If you watch his last fight against Chuck Wepner, Wepner thinks he's out of range because he's like 5 inches taller, and then the jab will just snap his head right back. So getting like the read on people's distance is very much a skill, but you have to be able to like see it first. You have to actually, you know, get them to reach for you and start to learn the distance that you can come back in with counters from. So as Adesanya will stick his head out there, he'll present that what we call a false distance. Roy Jones did it a lot, where you stick your head out ahead of your stance, so that when the opponent comes in, like lashes out at you, you can pull it back onto your stance, rather than stand on top of your stance and then try and pull your head back as they, back behind your center of gravity as they punch, which puts you in a bad position. You put yourself in a bad position to start, and then you pull back into a normal position. But he was putting his head out there, and Gastelum was clearly surprising with his speed, because some of those jabs were snapping Israel Adesanya's head right back. And Adesanya, to his credit, would go straight back to it. He'd go, okay, I'm learning the timing. It was the length and the speed here. But yeah, that speed was really a killer. Because Gastelum wasn't doing, very clever combinations or anything like that. He was just, it was jab left straight and jab right hook left straight. That was about it. But he was doing it very, very quick. He was coming in off a bounce, which I really liked. Because I thought, I wrote an article for Unibet, go read it if you haven't. But I thought ahead of this fight, I was going, is he going to go back to sort of the fight he fought against Uriah Hall? Not that there's an awful lot of similarity between Uriah Hall and Israel Adesanya, except that they're both, long-rangey strikers who are much taller and longer than him. And they're fights where you'd say, probably Kelvin's going to go to his wrestling a bit in this one. And against Adesanya, obviously, he was just pushing him to the cage over and over again. But then, against Hall, he was pushing him to the cage over again. But Adesanya's got very good footwork, so that was going to be one of the big differences. So I said in that article, like, 2 ways you deal with a long kicker. You either press in and keep them under pressure so that if they do stop and kick, they're always risking that, like, left hand coming down the centre. Or you take a step back and try and get him to overreach. And he was doing really well, out at range, bouncing. Israel would present him something and then he'd just burst in. But as the rounds progressed, it was a case of Gastelum slowing down, which was, made the counters more available for Adesanya. And also Adesanya was kicking the body, which was a good idea. Something he always does, but I think very important against an opponent who's beating you to the punch too. If you get rattled in the first round or whatever, or you're getting hit with a surprising number of blows, the temptation is to go, shit, I better knock this guy out, or I'm going to come back harder and hit him harder and make sure he feels it. Rather than, okay, let's keep trying to settle him down with body shots. The first knockdown that he scored on Gastelum was a weird one, because it was Gastelum trod on his foot, or tripped over his foot, and was sort of out of position, but the counter was just there, perfect. Like, he'd been getting out of the way, and then as soon as he slipped momentarily, he was smacked with a counter right hand. But it was sort of like round 2, 3, 4, you could see Adesanya getting the timing on the counter a bit better. He was still eating a lot of jabs and things like that were coming in surprisingly quick. But I think this is the thing, like, if you're still calling Kelvin Gastelum a fat welterweight, you're just an idiot, because, he's beaten some of the top middleweights. He could have won that fight with Jacare. The whole thing is murdering people with his speed and his conditioning. And clearly his speed was a problem for Adesanya. Compare him to someone like Brad Tavares or that Roy the Italian dude, what was his name? Who Adesanya just had the read on almost immediately. They were like, yep, I know exactly how fast this guy's going to move. But then that's why speed's the killer and not so much power. In the second round, I thought it was quite interesting watching the hand fighting, because when the lead hands were there, Kelvin would hand fight with him and try and jab off it and step down the side and throw the left straight. When the hand dropped, Kelvin would immediately jab. There was a little bit in was it the second round or the third round, where Gastelum was very clearly trying to step down the side, and he wasn't really switching up his movement or changing direction or doing anything like that. And Adesanya twigged it, threw a 1-2 at him just to like make a break in the action. And then as soon as Gastelum moved back in to step down the side, he let Gastelum check his lead hand, and then he spun into the back elbow just as Gastelum was stepping down the outside of that foot. That was gorgeous. Caught Gastelum quite clean on that one and knocked him down. Gastelum's chin is ridiculous. I was having to think about this during the fights. It was him and Poirier I was thinking about too, but guys who've gone up in weight and can take an incredible shot. I mean, Gastelum took a good shot down at welterweight, but Poirier didn't take a good shot down at featherweight, and now he takes a very good shot. And I remember, like, people in boxing fandom and boxers, whenever they're asked about MMA fighters, they'd be like, oh, they can't take a punch and that, this, that, and the other. And then it's interesting to think, because the massive weight cuts that you see in MMA came primarily from wrestling. Boxers cut weight, but they don't cut enormous amounts of weight, with a few exceptions like Margarito and people like that. And it makes you wonder, like, did MMA fighters get this reputation for being chinny? A lot of them have bad form and fight with their chins up, like Dustin Poirier does a lot of the time. But did they get this reputation for being chinny because of the large weight cuts they're all doing? Seems like every month there's another guy goes up in weight and suddenly takes an amazing shot and knocks out some top contender above him. The almost head kick finish in the fourth round was pretty incredible, and that's a merit of surprise. He didn't really throw that many kicks, and when he did kick, I thought he did well, Gastelum, because you can't, as I said last time, you can't be scared to kick with a kicker. You gotta back him up, and if you can kick if you back them up, you've got a chance to kick more readily than they do. So even if you've got like the stumpy ass low kicks like Dan Henderson, and they've got lovely switch kicks and stuff, like Lumpini Roundtree Jr., then, you've still got an advantage on them and you're getting your kicks off. And I thought when he threw his low kicks, they went well, but he threw one high kick. It was sloppy as hell, and everyone was like, oh, that was sloppy as hell. And then it was like he didn't realise that Israel Adesanya was hurt. There was a moment where he was like, what? And then he did realise Adesanya was hurt, moved in, stumbled in with some punches, and then ducked in on the fence for like a takedown attempt, which didn't come. And that was where people lost their minds. They're like, what's he doing? And I think he was probably just very tired. But high kicks, like, the whole thing about high kick is you can throw the shittiest high kick in the world. BJ Penn did against Diego Sanchez, but it's still the weight of your leg hitting someone in the head, which is considerably more than the weight of your fists and arm. Think about like Sonny Liston or Lennox Lewis's enormous fists and arms and how they gave them natural punching power. Your leg is probably about as heavy or more heavy than their arms. So, like, if you can throw it up there and actually hit someone with it, you've got a good chance of hurting them, even if it's with atrocious form. If you're going to do it consistently, it's good to be like Adesanya, where you can deceive people and turn them over, and you can recover your position well, and you don't need to, like, sprint into the kick to swing it up there. But yeah, it did its job. Incredible. And the other thing that shocked me was, coming into this fight, I was like, I don't make predictions or anything, but I go, well, there's one thing you can be sure of. Gastelum's not fighting someone he's going to be counter-wrestling. He's not going to be dealing with them trying to take him down. So he won't be using that arm roll at all. And then he fucking arm rolled a dude who wasn't wrestling with him. It was amazing. He ducked in on a high crotch. His takedown attempts were generally not the best timed. He landed a good one just as he was stepping in to throw right straight. But for the most part, Izzy was able to shuck him off really well. But he ducked in for like a high crotch, and Izzy went to a guillotine, and it looked like it was trouble. And then Gastelum, I think he went face up to the ceiling and rolled over and gave his back, and immediately gets the arm and the leg and rolls straight through onto top position against Adesanya. Adesanya wasn't even planning to do any wrestling or anything like that, and he somehow still got arm rolled. I've never seen anyone hit that move as much as Gastelum, so that was very cool. But the last round, Adesanya really got his timing down, was cracking him with counters, knocked him down 3 times in the last minute and a half, and definitely Mark Goddard could have waved it off, because the last knockdown, he was eating punches on the feet, flopped to the floor, got hit a few times. You could have waved it off, and then I think the last couple of punches missed, and he did roll back to get in on a single, as TJ Dillashaw, or E.P. Olashaw, as someone called him the other day, would say. But what a bloody fight. No qualms with the scoring. Kelvin Gastelum, if you, look at who he's lost to, with the exception of Weidman, where that was a finish, but all his losses, you're going, yeah, cool, run that back. I'd happily watch that one. Even the Woodley one, I'd watch that again, but... yeah, Israel wins the interim title, lines up the fight with Robert Whittaker. Cannot wait for that. A little bit of boy-on-boy violence. Israel has been saying that he's going to kill my boy. But, yeah, that's such a good fight. It's such a shame that Whittaker just can't stay healthy, because some of the stuff that guy's done has been incredible. But if I had to point to an area where I thought he could struggle, it would be maybe against a pure striker, because he's so good at stopping those big scary wrestlers from taking him down, or at least advancing once they get him down. But I think there's still holes in his striking. You know, he does. It's not so pronounced nowadays, but even going back to like the Uriah Hall fight and not so much the Jacare fight, maybe the Leites fight. No, did he fight Leites? Who was the big Brazilian he fought? Can't remember. But he will do like some nice slick boxing, and then he'll just swing randomly. It's that mix of like hillbilly haymakers and then some striking science, and then some more hillbilly haymakers. And I don't know how good his aggressive wrestling is, you know, and Adesanya is not going to give him the easy openings like Hall did, where, you know, spin for a back elbow, oh dear, I've given up my back for the next 5 minutes. But we'll talk more about that fight in the future. I cannot wait. This division is getting so good. And I was watching this and going, you know, it's only a few years ago we were going, Anderson Silva, best striker in middleweight history, versus Yushin Okami, tremendous wrestler, he's got a jab, he can box too. And you're like, well, no, actually, Kelvin Gastelum is a wrestler who can box too. Yushin Okami was... so just the level keeps going up and up and up, and it's so good. That's not to shit on Anderson Silva. We owe Anderson Silva a lot for inspiring a lot of these people to actually get to this level in their striking. It's great, because I used to have to write articles about, like, some guy using a jab once. You know, he can sort of jab. Let's write about him. Whereas now the striking has become sort of the key to the fight. I mean, if you're at a massive wrestling disadvantage, the wrestling is still the key. But the striking, the footwork, the control of the range, all dictates between two good fighters who is going to be able to do what. The main event, Max Holloway versus Dustin Poirier. This one surprised me. Because in their first fight was years and years ago, and I said, like, it doesn't really have a bearing on this, because it was a much sloppier Poirier and a much wilder Holloway. Holloway lost that fight because he was check hooking Poirier coming in, and then he decided to jump for a flying knee along the fence, got turned onto the fence, taken down, submitted. But doing the casual guide for Dustin Poirier, I was not super psyched about that. I did the Max Holloway one because I love watching Max Holloway, and there's so much to talk about. He's such a varied striker, generally. But doing the Dustin Poirier one, I wasn't super excited. Then I watched through his entire fightography in the UFC. Fightography. I'm a doctor of phytonomy and phytology. But the improvement in the last 4 fights is incredible. If you watch, even against Joe Duffy, his boxing was woeful. He was stepping and shifting on every punch, and he was leaving his chin out there. And Joe Duffy boxed him the fuck up. Like, there was nothing there was nothing Poirier was doing on the feet in that fight outside of the clinch that was any good. And Poirier got through it. He gritted his teeth, grabbed collar ties, ducked in for takedowns and things like that. But something about that, and then the loss to Johnson afterwards, really changed him. He still shifts on his punches, but it's not like his only thing now. He's got a jab, which is pretty amazing. Came out against Jim Miller and just jabbed his face off. And you're going, that's interesting. And then does the same to Justin Gaethje, and you're going, interesting. And then he did it to Eddie Alvarez twice, and you're going, okay. But he's landing these beautiful left-hand counters. He does a left straight when he's sort of stepping back. Like, he takes a step back with his left foot and throws the left straight at the same time. And it catches a lot of guys just stepping in on him. It works really well. He did it to Max, did it to Eddie, did it to... didn't throw his left hand as effectively against Gaethje, because Gaethje was sort of waiting on the left hand to throw his right hand. But yeah, pretty incredible improvement in Dustin. So I went into that fight being like, you know, having a new appreciation of Poirier. And I don't think I've ever seen anyone improve that fast. Because his defense against guys like McGregor and stuff like that, it was just to put the open hand palm out for the jab and put his other hand up high, like forearm up high. And McGregor just took him apart in a minute because he can just shoot around it because it's a stationary guard. And now he's got this shoulder roll. I called it the hillbilly shoulder roll jokingly, but he's not hillbilly. That was what McGregor called him. He's actually Cajun. He's the raging Cajun. But yeah, just incredible. And it's not like perfect stonewall defense because he does some weird stuff. If you watched in this fight against Holloway, he goes to the shoulder roll, the southpaw shoulder roll, which is weird to start with, and then he steps his right foot back so that his legs are like square, and he's square to the opponent doing the shoulder roll, which is very, very strange. But playing around with that and exploring that has made him into this very weird striker who's deceptively hard to hit. And Holloway said between round 3 and 4, I think it was, he said in his corner, he's blocking weird. Holloway could not hit him clean for a lot of that fight. And if you notice, like the very first punch that Holloway throws, he hits Poirier on the elbow and shakes his hand out immediately afterwards. I'm not saying like he broke his hand and that changed the fight or anything like that, but clearly he went in expecting to be able to hit Poirier and punched him right in the elbow. And then there's another one, I think towards the end of the first round, where Poirier misses him, walks past him, and you're like, oh, he's badly out of position. Max loads up this left hook and hits Poirier just as Poirier like nods the top of his head down into the line of it. And there were so many moments in this fight where I was like, ouch, for Max's hands. That's the whole thing about this shoulder roll stuff. And why I thought that it would be, I've been saying for years, work on the shoulder roll, work on the cross guard. I think shoulders and elbows and forearms and upper arms, those big pieces of meat and bone are going to be the future of guarding in MMA. You can't be putting on... double forearms guard works to a degree, but it's just so porous, unless you're moving your hands around a lot. Whereas the shoulder roll is actually pretty easy to sort of move around and work out how to change the angle of your elbow and complicate the path of their strikes. Southpaw shoulder roll typically... If you watch someone like Zab Judah, we're not talking traditional boxing, so it's a little bit different, but if you watch Zab Judah, he'd use the shoulder roll a lot to take the jab and then try and come back with like big left uppercuts. But if you're going southpaw shoulder roll against an orthodox fighter, you can use the rear hand to parry their rear straights, their right straights, onto your shoulder, so you're like putting it on the shoulder roll. But the other thing that he was doing, like Poirier was doing, is really projecting that elbow. He lifts the elbow up high and like shoves it out, basically into the path of the right straight of the opponent. So you have to like be careful throwing punches at someone like that. It's what's it called in luta libre? There's this little old guy teaches luta libre in Brazil. They asked him for like his top 10 principles of grappling, and one of them was like the porcupine. And he said, anytime someone's like laying on you or anything, just make sure an elbow is sticking into them somehow. And it's sort of like that. As long as there's something poking out, it's quite hard to throw punches at someone because you will hit an elbow. Whitaker versus Romero 2. Romero's doing the cross guard. It's wrong. It's the wrong arm on top, so he can't actually left hook off it comfortably. But the act of cross guarding, there are a couple of times where Whitaker punches him square in the elbow and hurts his hand. And one of the things I was really enjoying about this event was, I watched it backwards because I watched it the next morning. So I'd watched the main and co-main, and I was like, yes, this gels with my belief that sort of like point fighty footwork, in and out bouncing stuff, and guards incorporating folding behind the elbows and shoulders are the future of MMA. Then I watched Khalil Roundtree versus Eric Anders, and he's doing like traditional Muay Thai. So it's pretty amazing. That's what I love about this sport. It's not so much it has to be like this. This is how it should be done. Which in boxing there's very much a sense of that. This is the way to throw the jab. If you've been taught another way by another coach, he's wrong. In MMA, it's still sort of like, what can you get to work? And nothing, there's no more clear example of that than Kelvin Gastelum, because he fights nothing like Rafael Cordero's other fighters, but clearly it's working, and Rafael Cordero is working with it as a coach. But back to that Stonewall, Philly Shell, Hillbilly shoulder roll, whatever you want to call it. It's quite interesting, because around the time of I think it was the Jim Miller fight, while I was watching these, they were saying that Poirier had cut back massively on the amount of sparring he was doing, which is interesting, because like, the shoulder roll style, you think of that as something that people with a lot of like sparring rounds do. It's something that they go, oh, okay, how do I stay safe as safe as possible while someone's throwing punches at me? Better master this. Whereas it seems that if he has cut back on his sparring and just worked on shoulder roll stuff, it's probably just doing mitt combinations and things like that with coaches for the most part. But pretty incredible. He's been playing with this stuff, and maybe it's taking the pressure off. If you're not sparring as much, you don't have the pressure to get in there and make it a war. And it's very hard to choose what you do in sparring if you're just sparring. If you want to become a very good defensive fighter, but the only way that you've worked out how to stop the other guy doing his thing is to get in his face first, you'll never become a very good defensive fighter. Which has been kind of the problem with guys like Fabricio Verdum. You watch the footage of him sparring with Vanderlei, and it's just like both of them windmilling, and he's learned to windmill as hard as possible and first, so that he gets on the front foot. And that's why Verdum's answer to everything has always been to throw the 1-2 back as hard as he can. But yeah, Dustin looked phenomenal. Max, for his part, looked well. Firstly, his jab was not very effective because the lead shoulder roll and Dustin's hand fighting and head movement all made it very difficult. But I'm going to go to fight metric now, or UFC stats as it's now called. Dangerous stuff, because if you go to UFC stats, you get the stat that Max Holloway landed 181 significant strikes and Dustin Poirier landed 178. Which, if you're one of those guys who's like, can we go to the fight metric and talk about the decision, would probably make you think that Max Holloway won. But obviously, if you watched the fight, you probably didn't feel that way. What we do like using fight metric for is to confirm what we were thinking during the fight. I was thinking, Max didn't get to the body much. Out of the 450 strikes that Max threw, 50 of them were to the body. And I also thought, because in the pre-fight I was like, Dustin Poirier has a lot of trouble with low kicks, especially now that he's fighting on top of his feet out of that stance. He uses his feet like a boxer does now, and that means that they're often planted and exposed for those kicks. Jim Miller got himself back into the fight by kicking Poirier's legs. Max Holloway also has problems with low kicks, by the way. He doesn't check almost any, with the exception of the fights versus Aldo, where he came out like, kick me in the leg, motherfucker, because that's the one thing I've been training for. But only 50 strikes thrown to the body out of 450 is an important one, and only 39 of those landed. But that's a good landing percentage for body shots, so he could have got to it, which is the problem. But only 2 leg kicks thrown, which is really getting distracted from a very obvious area where Dustin has had trouble. And this is how quick Dustin's improvement in the boxing has snuck up, because Holloway was genuinely said to his corner, he's blocking weird, and they were like, I know. And I'd missed this until I went back and watched his fights in chronological order and said, oh my god, look at what's happened in these last 4 fights, just those. So that should tell you how quick he's come along. But if you're planning for like a third match, if you were Max's corner, because I don't believe that Max, I don't believe that's an unwinnable fight for Max at all. But he really got drawn into just throwing at the head and couldn't really throw as hard as he wanted because he was worried about the elbows and shoulders and things getting in the way. I think if you're Max's corner, you've got to go for more kicks, especially low kicks, and you've got to go body kicks and lots of body shots. And it shows how good Dustin is that he managed to rattle Holloway and get the most varied striker in the featherweight division, and one of the most varied strikers in MMA, to focus entirely on punching him in the head, even when he couldn't quite get to his head most of the time. There was an annoying moment in round 3 where, if you saw the Filthy Casuals guide to Max, I was like, my pet peeve about Max was that he used to throw flying knees and get turned onto the fence, and then he did it in round 3 after seemingly rattling Dustin with like a combination of about 8 head strikes. I think I would like to see more elbows out of Holloway, because, if you have someone who's got a very good chin, like Dustin has shown to have in recent years, you want to go for cuts and swelling. If you're hitting the head, that is. So flicking jabs to the eye and elbows if you get close enough or end up in the clinch or breaking from the clinch. There was a beautiful break from he had a collar, they came together, Dustin had a collar tie holding the back of Holloway's head, and he did the same arm to elbow on the break. It was gorgeous. And then there was that beautiful knee that split Holloway's face wide open. What a brilliant fight. And Dustin was nothing like that, like 4 fights ago. It's absolutely incredible. And I said at the end of the Filthy Casuals guide to Dustin, there's stuff in his game that I don't think he's ever going to shore up, like hole-wise. And people asked what that was, and I didn't actually get to talk about it in the video because I try and keep the videos down to like 5 minutes, and obviously if you want to get them out fairly quickly, it's quite hard to do everything about a fighter. But when he starts throwing like both hands in combination, his chin comes right out in front of his chest, and his hands are like down by his sides. And when he switches into his orthodox stance to chase people with like a double jab, it's not really a double jab. He's just got like his hand out in front of him and his chin up in the air. And he can get like badly check hooked there. He got hurt by Eddie Alvarez when he was pouring it on along the fence, and he got hurt by Max exactly the same way in the first round. He's moving in on him along the fence. Max check hooks him, and he falls on his knees. And Dustin has a very good chin. He's just presenting it and moving in a way where he's going to trip over his feet. It's like we talked about DJ versus Dodson, TJ versus Dodson. If you're between stances when you get hit, you're likely to fall over no matter how okay you are with being hit. Prattled on about that for quite a while, so let's talk about like the fallout of this fight. Poirier is supposed to be fighting Khabib next, unless... Well, I'm very surprised there hasn't been an immediate statement from Conor McGregor, but perhaps he is keeping his head down because of all this external stuff that's going on. Maybe he's keeping a low profile, but I would have, like, even going into this fight where I thought Max probably had the edge, I still would have, if you told me that Dustin would win, I'd still probably say that Max has the better style for Khabib, because Max is probably better with like elusive footwork and ring generalship. You don't really see either man on his back much, but what I have seen of Poirier on his back, and again, with the rate that Poirier's improved, I could be talking out my arse. But to be honest, I think it's quite unlikely that he's made these incredible strides in his boxing and he's matched it in his jiu-jitsu. That would be stunning if he's spending that amount of time on boxing and then also that amount of time on jiu-jitsu and having the same effects. But his featherweight fights, he ended up on his back quite a bit. His fight with Eric Koch, I mean, we're going back quite a way now to see him on his back. Jim Miller got him down and got on his back. The thing about Dustin Poirier's ground game is that I always think of him as quite a good grappler because his profile picture used to be him in a black belt robe, so he's obviously a black belt in jiu-jitsu. Mind you, he could not be. I mean, who's gonna argue with him? But when I've seen him on his back, he's been kind of inactive. When guys get on his back, I've seen him sort of like linger there and not really make stuff happen. Eric Koch is the example I'm thinking of. I can't remember how he got Miller off his back. I think he turned into him, or maybe the round ended. Yeah, you don't see a lot of Poirier scrambling up along the fence, but then you haven't seen him taken down an awful lot. So the flip side of that, of course, is that Poirier came into the UFC as a banger, but his specialty was the Darce choke. And when dudes shot on him, he'd catch the front headlock, sprawl back, go for the Darce. Now, Khabib isn't undarceable. Khabib isn't unchokeable, and he isn't unsprawlable. He shot in on Michael Johnson, and Michael Johnson sprawled on him, and Michael Johnson's not a big lightweight. He's now down at featherweight, and he's not a particularly world-class wrestler in most people's estimation. And I mean, this was part of the interest with Tony too, especially as Khabib likes to shoot with his head on the outside for pick up the high crotch, because his dad believes that it's safer to do that and not risk being kneed or uppercutted, but you do risk the guillotine. So I mean, there's opportunities for someone who's got wicked front headlock work like Tony Ferguson. So yeah, I'd be interested to see what Poirier can do there. However, the thing that has let a lot of Khabib's opponents down is the ring craft, letting him run them onto the fence. You need like a Holly Holm style ring general, will not stand still, will not let the fence touch her back foot, constantly moving off to the side. And again, all this changes when you get hit. I mean, Adesanya, when he got hit with that high kick, it might not have been the high kick, I think it was one of the punches that hurt him, but you could tell he was hurt because he immediately, he pulled away from some punches the next time Gastelum came in, and he stepped straight back onto the fence, and he doesn't do that normally. Normally he goes back and then off to the side, and he wasn't doing it, so I was like, oh, he's clearly still ringing a little bit from whatever he just ate. But yeah, Dustin does a lot of straight line retreats. He does a lot of punching while going backwards, which I said earlier surprises people, but I don't think he's the kind of man who can avoid an opponent. He's not super elusive. He's hard to hit, but he's not hard to get a hold of, I don't think. But I'm willing to be proved wrong, and I would love to be proved wrong. I'm so on board with the Dustin Poirier hype train now. Actually, I forgot to mention Israel Adesanya's triangle attempt while we're talking about anti-wrestler stuff. That was slick. How often do you see a almost triangle in a title fight, no less? There were 3 triangles in the UFC, last year or the year before. It's a very rare submission to see at the highest levels, and this was the highest of the highest levels, and Israel Adesanya almost triangled Kelvin Gastelum off that beautiful arm roll, no less. Very cool. Right, let's do a couple of questions, and then we'll come back and talk about that dreadful heavyweight main event on Thursday, probably. Hi, Jack. A lot of bare-knuckle boxing proponents say that it's a safer alternative to wearing gloves, largely because they correctly point out that punching someone's head with a bare fist is likely to lead to damage to your hand, meaning you would have to go for softer targets instead, leading to a lower risk of brain damage for bare-knuckle fighters. Do you think this point holds up? When the stakes are high, as in any combat sports match, fighters often show complete disregard for such injuries, such as Jacare carrying on with a broken arm against Roger Gracie in the Mundial's final, or Robert Whittaker or Paul Felder still throwing punches with their broken arms. What makes bare-knuckle boxing any different? In the Lobov versus Knight fight this weekend, both fighters were predominantly going for the head, and as such we were left with bloody messes for hands, which doesn't seem particularly sustainable in the long term. Thanks, Matt. I'll say it again, but I would love BKB to be great, but it's not. It's shit. It's bad MMA fighters and bad boxers fighting in a sport that like messes up what they do. I watched the event, and the very first fight, they had a boxer versus MMA guy, and the boxer immediately, the first punch he threw, he then looked at his hand like he'd broken it. There was a lot of that, dudes throwing punches and looking at their own hands, and like people were talking to me about this in the week. They're like, but people still punch the head. You know, you said that in the old days, bare knuckle boxing guys focused on the body. The good ones did. Like Broughton got famous for body shots because he would they worked out that you were going to break your hands. I think one of the things that's not going to help, firstly, a meta would be established if this went on long enough and guys made a career out of it, but it's probably not going to because all these bare knuckle boxing promotions are super shady and can't pay their fighters. Like Paulie Malignaggi is going to turn up, break his hands on Artem Lobov's head, and then probably not get paid what he was promised. But I think the 2-minute rounds don't help. You know, in a pugilistic contest in 16, 17, 1800s, the rounds were decided by knockdowns. So if you slipped or you went down on a knee, some guys would just take a knee if they were tired, and everyone would go boo. But the rounds are decided by who is downed, which means that you could have 40, 50, 60 rounds. They were long contests and the rounds didn't matter because you weren't being scored. Whereas these fights are like 3 2-minute rounds, and 2 minutes is just go out there and swing wild. I like that they're allowing the holding and hitting, because that basically means that MMA fighters can smash boxers, because you get in close, you grab a collar tie and you just uppercut them because they don't know how to deal with it. You know, that's wrestling, that's not boxing. Yeah, if there were 3-minute, 4-minute, 5-minute rounds, or you went until a knockdown or something like that per round, if you went like traditional bare knuckle rules, you would see guys slow it way down, and you would see guys with fast jabs flicking in the jab to the eyes, and you would see a lot more body shots, I reckon. But at the moment, it's shit boxers and shit MMA fighters having shit boxing matches with no gloves for 2 minutes. So it's not very good. It's kind of like Letway. Like, I love the rule set, but then you realise it's just a load of really poor kids who aren't great fighters fighting. If 2 of the best Muay Thai guys in the world said, fuck it, let's have a Letway match. You know, when Nathan Corbett and Tyrone Spong were going to fight for a Muay Thai world title, and Tyrone Spong was like, but I don't want any elbows allowed. I would love it if 2 guys just agreed to have like a Letway match. I'll take him tonight, and I'll take him with headbutts. That would be amazing, but it's not going to happen. Unless Chatri decides overnight that Giorgio versus Yord in the final it's going to be bare knuckle and headbutts are allowed. That's how you fuck over Giorgio Petrosian if you want to. Just have this super smooth outfighter and be like, but headbutts are legal and no gloves, so bleed away, lads. Dear Jack, long-time podcast subscriber / Patreon boy here. Your podcasts are always a delight, not only due to the humour, entertainment aspect, but also the cerebral nature of your breakdowns. I'm Triple H, the cerebral assassin. I am a filmmaker, and I'm currently writing a screenplay that is centered around the sport of MMA. My question is, what do you think is the central appeal of MMA, and on a grander scale, of violence? Someone always said, don't tell the story that you understand, tell the one that you don't, so the audience can explore it with you. I have adored MMA with a passion since my early years, but never understood my own love for it. Whenever anyone asks me why I like MMA, I grumble something about violent poetry in motion. You can't quite articulate it. Why do you love combat sports, and how would you articulate your love to a filthy casual? Love, Tommy. That's a good question. I was about to say, hold on to your hats, we're going to get wanky here, because I was going to wax poetic about, high-level physical problem solving with dire physical consequences, or whatever it is. No, I think there is something about violence that is at its base level appealing. Or, Dana White has that quote that's like, if you go to an NFL game and there's a fight in the stands, what's everyone watching? It's the fight in the stands. There is something about it, but that does turn a lot of people off. What I find interesting is, if any of you listening have like a long-suffering wife who doesn't care about combat sports, there are still fights that get them excited, and it's very interesting to see. I think a lot of it is storytelling and things like that. My wife was... we were watching the Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury fight together. She'd done a lot of work with like mental health organizations, and she'd heard about Tyson Fury, and I said, yeah, he's got a fight coming up tonight, and we watched it together, and she was so invested in it, and it's really interesting because that is not remove all the context, and that's not one of the fights you would say, like, that'll get people hot under the collar. Show that to any non-boxing fan and they'll love that. You know, that very much was the story, and then it was a very slow-building fight. You know, it was Tyson doing everything right but not getting hit, and then when he did get hit, you were like, fuck! And then when he got up, you're like, fuck! So, it really does, like, it can't just be the blood and guts. I think something about the human story of fighters really helps, and that's the thing that's very hard to get across to people, especially when you're dealing with people who are so bad at selling their own fighters. You know, when Ronda and Conor are on Conan, they're huge. You know, like, people are like, oh yeah, I saw him on Conan, he seemed like a cool guy, and I've heard his story, and now I'm going to go read a newspaper piece about him and find out more about him. The UFC are generally very bad at getting their fighters into the spotlight. And I think that's always going to be the gateway to get people in. There are people who are just into violence, but I think more than that, like, I've got a she's not just into violence, but I have a friend who didn't watch any fighting. Her husband sat her down to watch McGregor versus Diaz when that came on, and then they watched, was it Joshua versus Klitschko? Happened shortly after that. But then she was properly into fights after that. I think getting people through the door, I think there's a lot more people would like fighting as a sport and appreciate the ins and outs of it and the flow of action than you would think. But I think getting them in the door takes a story or some particular star. It doesn't even have to be a star, but like, if their story is well advertised, I think that really helps. If that YouTuber boxing event had like a couple of actual top level amateur boxers in there, you know, in the middle of the card, you know, maybe people would care about that. But I think MMA also has the appeal that boxing does not, where it appeals to a lot of martial arts dudes and people who are interested in how to fight. And I mean that in the way that, like, men are. I mean, it's going to come across sexist, but men do tend to think, like, you know, what would I do if someone came around that corner with a knife right now? and you know, they're interested in the how and the why things work. And I think MMA is a really interesting sport in that regard. And the reason that a lot of people found it was through Hoist Gracie, you know, and things like that, where it was, and the Gracie Challenge stuff, where it was trying to find out what fighting style is the best. It used to be that you'd be in the pub going, well, I can't see a kung fu man beating a Shotokan man, if I'm honest. You know, and then you had an actual tournament and you could find out what style of fighting works best. So I think it's going to be different for everyone. There are other people who are just interested in base violence. And to be honest, the more fights I watch, the more I do appreciate a good blood and guts brawl. But I got into it through, like, martial artsy stuff. Other people get into it through the story of one particular fighter or something like that. You know, there are people here in MMA now, oh, I feel so embarrassed. I got in through Conor McGregor and I'm such a noob. And you're like, well, don't worry, because we had the tough noobs. We had all sorts of noobs come in, Rousey noobs. And you're still around, you know, because you found out you like fighting by watching Conor McGregor. I mean, it's weird, because I watched some riot officer get the shit kicked out of him in France this week. I was watching a video of that. Like, he'd broken the line and decided to just charge these protesters on his own, and they, like, whipped his helmet off and beat the shit out of him. And I was like, I can't watch that. That's not fun at all. You know, the sporting nature of it makes it a lot more interesting for me. But even then, if I find out that they're, you know, we talk about fighters being underpaid, but if I find out Letway guys or bare-knuckle boxing guys or whatever, they're getting $200 to fight, I'm suddenly like, I don't really want to watch this anymore. You know, I like high-level fights between people who like fighting for big cash prizes, if I'm honest, and that's a very specific niche of fighting to like, but that's what gets me going. Cheers, Tommy. Hey, Jack, I've read/listened to a lot of your stuff, so forgive me if you've answered this before. What is your opinion of weight training for fighters? A lot of opinions I read state that it's unnecessary and slows you down, but it's hard for me to imagine that someone like Canelo, brackets chonky boy, doesn't pump up his delts and biceps with something other than boxing. We generally do a few rounds of bodyweight exercises every time I train, but would it be detrimental to add a day or two of squat/bench/deadlift/overhead press? I've lost a huge amount of muscle since swapping powerlifting for boxing. There we go. There's your problem. Swapping powerlifting for boxing after 2 Achilles ruptures. Ooh, Achilles ruptures. I'd like to find a balance. Cheers, Gar. Okay, right. Reading the last part of that, I'm probably not going to be able to give you any useful advice because you're going to be a lot more experienced in lifting than me. But I've always had trouble, like, trying to get the balance between lifting and cardio. I enjoy lifting a lot more, But when my cardio is good, I enjoy everything a lot more. Like when you turn up to training and you can do 7, 8, 9 rounds of rolling, and you're like, you will be tired by the end, but you're going, I'm feeling really good. You're not just thinking, oh God, I'm just going to lay here in bottom side control and not let him submit me for a while. That's an amazing feeling on its own. So it's kind of that balance. It's very hard to get. In recent years, I've actually been getting into more Brian Alshrew's stuff. I love that guy. He's a bit of an inspiration, but like he's got a brain tumor and parasites and stuff, but he's still just mad strong. But he does a lot of giant sets, and for people who have never heard of giant sets, you've probably heard of giant sets if you've been powerlifting for a while. But giant sets are basically where you stack a load of exercises together around your main lift. I mean, you can definitely go watch his videos about that. But like, if you take a day of the week for bench and a day of the week for squats and so on, you add, I think it's an what's it called? Not ancillary. Antagonistic? Yeah, the opposite movement, basically. Then you do your bench or your squat or your deadlift or your overhead, and then you do some abs, and then you do some conditioning, and then you don't have a big break before you go into your next round. So you have to lower your weights to start with. But I've really been playing with that and enjoying it, and it's allowed me to not have to worry so much about doing conditioning and things, because the balancing of hours in the day makes it very hard to do enough strength stuff and conditioning stuff, and also the training that you're doing it for. Like I do lifting and cardio because I want to be better at the thing I actually enjoy. It can end up eating up all your time preparing for the thing you enjoy. But I think the thing about being muscle bound and stuff, that's quite an old school view. You asked about Canelo. Canelo definitely lifts weights, but there were people like Jeff Lacey, who was chonk. He was a big lad. And he used to claim that his physique was all body weight. You're like, I can see your capped delts, mate. You are not just doing body weight stuff. But yeah, it's quite interesting. Like someone sent me this week. Thank you to Landon, who's. It looks like your question I'm not going to get in this week, but I will get in next week. Landon sent me a link to the PDF of Rocky Marciano's book, Boxing and Bodybuilding, and Rocky Marciano did a lot of weights, especially for that time when guys didn't think that boxers should do weights, and he was hugely powerful. And I think there is a degree of, I don't think it's the muscle that makes people slow down and like, clumsy. I think a lot of what goes with it, there's nothing about being stronger or having like a faster, stronger muscle that's going to be detrimental to you as in a fight sport, except maybe whatever the thing that Rogan always says about needing more oxygen. But within reason, having a stronger muscle will allow you to move faster and more powerfully. What doesn't help, if your whole goal is to move as much weight as possible, you will pack on weight to do that. Hence, powerlifters not looking like bodybuilders. Or if your whole goal is to look muscle bound, you will go out of your way to be ultra muscle bound to the point where you can't like raise your arms above your head. So there's an extreme of everything, but I can't see adding some squat, bench, deadlift, and overhead press ruining anything. I like any coach that's telling you don't do any of that is, well, firstly, overstepping their bounds into your regular life. Don't have any other interests. I used to know a guy who was like, he was a big karate sensei, coach, master, whatever, and he was like, don't do yoga, it's counterintuitive to your karate. And you're like, what the fuck, mate? Just stay in your lane. But, I would say play with it and see what works best for you. I'm having great fun, like, up in my lifts and trying to incorporate my conditioning with it. Maybe you would too. Certainly in grappling and sports where you have to grapple with the opponent, it's not a good idea to not do any weights. Anytime I catch myself thinking, I'm quite tired, maybe if I just rolled, I'd be better off. I always think of Fedor, because he was like, I believe the weight of wrestling with a partner is all I need. And then he massively dropped off after he stopped lifting weights and things. I mean, there were other reasons for his drop off, but it's just what I always think of. Cheers, Gart. Right, I reckon that'll do us for the Monday podcast. I will be back on Thursday, I reckon. If you are a Patreon boy, I finally got my Boxer Rebellion episode up. It's about 2 hours. It's a long one, but I had tremendous fun doing it. And if you like your Chinese history and your weird martial arts cults, that's for you. We got a Muhammad Ali one. I'm about an hour from finishing, probably. And then we're going to do some Dream lightweight Grand Prix stuff too, because that is one of my favourite tournaments ever. And I finally got it on my computer, and I started watching it, and I was like, what the fuck's this? And it was Kenny Rice and Ron Kroc, and I was like, oh my god. So it's so good, I forgot that they were involved. So get on the Patreon and enjoy that shit. If you haven't seen the Filthy Casuals guides to Max Holloway and Dustin Poirier, go do that. I'm probably going to take them down soon because I don't like... I'm very much of the opinion that they're fair use. I'm not making any money from them. I don't monetize my YouTube channel at all. It's stuff I put up for fun. I've opted out of all the adverts at every opportunity. If there are any on there, it's because of the guy who owns Enter the Dragon's music, which I put on the start of my thing. But what I'll probably do is start taking down the earlier ones. So, if you want to download them. But I don't want to piss off the UFC, as they've let me do these without any interruption. As they're being so kind to me and letting me do it, I think I'll probably delete the earlier ones and I'll just keep the most recent ones up at any point in time. But go watch those. If you want to send an email to the podcast, fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing at any time, including my most recent work at Unibet, go to fightprimer.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Katamari, Kelvin, Gastelum, bless.